The late evening light spread slowly across the quiet fields. The wind moved gently through the tall, dry grass, and the air smelled like dust and old wood. Daniel rode his horse slowly along the fence line, as he had done every evening for years. The ranch was silent except for the sound of the saddle creaking and the steady steps of his horse. He liked this silence. It was the only thing that felt safe after the painful years that had passed. Daniel was a tall man with calm eyes that had seen too much. He had lived alone for a long time. He had lost people he loved, and since then, he had built strong walls around his heart. Every day he woke up early, worked on the land, fixed broken fences, and returned home to the same empty house. He thought this was how the rest of his life would stay, quiet, steady, and alone. But that night was not like every other night. As Daniel rode closer to the old creek bed, he heard something strange. It was soft at first, like the sound of wind through dry leaves, but then he heard it again. A faint sound, a cry. He stopped his horse and listened. The land was quiet except for that small, weak sound. His heart tightened and he turned his horse toward the sound. The creek was nearly dry this time of year, just a shallow strip of cold water running through the dirt. As Daniel came closer, he saw a small figure near the edge. At first he thought it was maybe a wounded animal. But when he stepped down from his horse and walked closer, he saw it was a young woman sitting on the ground. She was shaking. Her clothes were wet and dirty. Her hair stuck to her face and her arms were wrapped around her knees. She looked like someone who had walked a long way with no strength left. Her shoes were muddy and her face was pale. Daniel took a careful step forward. He didn't want to frighten her. She lifted her head slowly, her eyes red from crying, and then in the smallest and weakest voice she whispered something that made his chest hurt. "Please, just make it quick." Daniel froze where he stood. He wasn't sure if she was talking to him or to the world. But those words were heavy. They didn't sound like fear of him. They sounded like she had already lost hope. He still had his rifle hanging from his shoulder. He didn't even realize he was holding it until he saw the way she looked at it. She didn't move away. She didn't scream. She just sat there waiting like someone who had stopped fighting. Daniel slowly lowered the rifle. Not because she was a danger, but because he didn't want her to feel any more fear than she already did. He spoke softly. "Ma'am, I'm not going to hurt you," he said, his voice steady and calm. She didn't answer. Her hands tightened around her knees and she looked down at the ground. Her body was thin, like someone who hadn't eaten properly for days. Daniel looked around. It was getting darker by the minute. The air was cold. If she stayed out here all night, she might not make it. He took a small step closer, his boots pressing against the dry dirt. She flinched but didn't run. He could see in her eyes that she didn't have the strength to run anymore. "What's your name?" he asked quietly. No answer. Only the sound of the wind. He could have walked away. It would have been the easier choice. She was a stranger, and bringing strangers to his land was something he never did. But something inside him whispered that if he turned away now, he would regret it for the rest of his life. He knelt down slowly, lowering himself so he wouldn't tower over her. The horse stood a few steps behind him, quiet and still. "It's all right," Daniel said again. "You're safe now." She shook her head slowly as if she didn't believe those words anymore. Her lips trembled. She was young, maybe in her 20s, but her eyes carried the tired look of someone who had faced too much pain for her age. Daniel took off his jacket and held it out to her. "It's cold," he said simply. For a long moment, she didn't move. Then slowly she reached out with shaking hands and took the jacket. She wrapped it tightly around herself like it was the only warm thing she had left in the world. Daniel stood back up and extended his hand toward her. She looked at it like it was something strange, something she didn't trust. Her eyes moved from his hand to his face. He didn't push her. He just stood there quietly, letting her make the choice. Finally, after what felt like a long time, she placed her cold, shaking hand in his. He pulled her gently to her feet. She wobbled, weak from exhaustion. "Can you walk?" he asked. She nodded weakly. Daniel led her to his horse. She looked at the animal with fear, like someone who had never been close to a horse before. He helped her climb up carefully, making sure she felt steady. She sat there silently, holding onto the saddle, her eyes distant. As Daniel walked beside the horse, guiding it back to the ranch, the sun disappeared completely. The sky turned dark blue and stars began to appear. The only sounds were the quiet steps of the horse and the soft rustle of the wind through the grass. Daniel glanced up at her a few times. She didn't look back. Her head rested slightly forward, her body tired and weak. But even in her silence, he could feel something. She didn't trust him yet, but she also hadn't pushed him away. The ranch came into view in the distance. It wasn't fancy, just a small wooden house with a porch and warm light glowing from one window. The barn stood beside it, old but strong. The windmill creaked slowly in the breeze. It was a quiet place, far away from the noise of the world. When they arrived, Daniel helped her down. She was light, like someone who hadn't eaten properly for days. Her steps were slow, and she leaned on him without even realizing it. He didn't say anything. He just supported her gently as they walked toward the porch. She looked around with cautious eyes, as if she wasn't sure if she belonged anywhere anymore. Daniel opened the door and let her step inside. The warm air from the fireplace touched her face, and for a brief moment her shoulders loosened. He guided her to the chair near the fire. She sat down carefully, still holding his jacket close to her chest. Her breathing was uneven, but she didn't cry anymore. She just stared at the flames like someone trying to remember what warmth felt like. Daniel stood a few steps away, unsure of what to say. He had lived alone for so long that he had forgotten how to comfort someone. But something about her silence made him want to help. "Do you want some water?" he asked softly. She gave a small nod. He brought her a glass of water, and her hands shook as she held it. She drank slowly, like someone who hadn't trusted anything in a long time. Daniel didn't ask too many questions that night. He didn't ask why she was out there, where she came from, or what she was running from. He knew some answers only came when a person felt safe again. As the fire cracked softly, the sound of the wind outside grew softer. She leaned back in the chair, wrapped in his jacket, and slowly closed her eyes. Daniel watched her quietly. A stranger had walked into his quiet life that night, not with loud words, but with a single broken whisper. And something inside him knew that this was the moment when his life would no longer stay the same. She had asked him to make it quick. But instead he had lowered his gun and made a different choice. A choice to help, a choice to care. And that choice was just the beginning of a story neither of them could have seen coming. The night had passed slowly but gently. The young woman slept near the fire, wrapped in Daniel's jacket, while the wind outside carried a soft, lonely sound. Daniel sat on the porch for hours, listening to the night. He couldn't explain why he had brought her here. Something in her eyes had spoken louder than words. She was broken, but she was still holding on, even if just a little. When the first light of morning touched the hills, Daniel made a simple breakfast: hot oatmeal, fresh water, and a little bread. The smell of warm food spread through the house. Slowly, the woman opened her eyes. For a moment, she looked around like she wasn't sure where she was. Her body tensed up, but when she saw Daniel sitting near the table, not saying a word, something in her shoulders relaxed. "Morning," Daniel said softly. She nodded slightly. Her voice was still weak, so she didn't speak at first. Daniel placed the bowl of oatmeal on the table. She stared at it, unsure if she should move. "It's just food," he said gently. "You're safe here." Her hands shook as she held the bowl, but she ate slowly, like someone who hadn't had a warm meal in days. Daniel didn't ask her anything. He knew some questions could break a fragile heart. She needed to breathe first. After breakfast, she sat quietly by the window. Sunlight touched her face, showing the tired lines beneath her eyes. Daniel noticed she wasn't just tired. She carried the weight of something heavy. Finally, after a long silence, she spoke in a soft voice. "My name is Emily." Daniel looked up and nodded. "I'm Daniel." She wrapped her arms around herself like she was holding in all the broken pieces. "I didn't think anyone would help me," she whispered. Daniel didn't try to make big promises. He simply said, "You're not alone right now." Over the next few days, Emily slowly got used to the quiet rhythm of the ranch. Daniel never pushed her to talk. He fixed fences, fed the horses, and worked in the barn like always. She followed him at a distance at first, just watching. She was still learning to trust the silence. At night, she sat near the fireplace while Daniel read old books or polished his tools. She didn't speak much, but every evening her face softened a little more. She began to eat better. She started brushing her hair again. She began to look less like a shadow and more like a person trying to return to life. One afternoon, Daniel was struggling to fix a broken water pump. Emily quietly walked up to him. "Can I help?" she asked. Daniel handed her a small wrench. Sure. It was a simple moment, but it was the first time she had offered to do something. They worked together in the warm sunlight. She wasn't strong yet, but her hands were steady. When the water finally started flowing again, Daniel saw something he hadn't seen before. Her small smile. It wasn't a loud smile. It was soft, shy, and real. Thank you, she said. For what? He asked. For treating me like a person. Daniel didn't know how to answer that. He just nodded and returned to work. But inside he felt something shift, a quiet warmth that had been missing for a long time. Weeks passed and the quiet bond between them grew. Emily began feeding the chickens in the morning and helping with the horses in the evening. She liked the animals because they didn't ask questions. They simply accepted her. Daniel never asked about the night he found her by the creek. But one evening, when the sky was orange and pink, she sat on the porch and finally spoke about it. She told him about the town she had left behind. She told him how everything had fallen apart in her life. She told him how she had walked for days with no food, no hope, and no one to call. She told him that she didn't want to die, but she had stopped believing that anyone would help her live. Daniel listened quietly. He didn't interrupt. He didn't give her empty words. He just sat beside her, letting the sound of the wind fill the spaces where her voice shook. When she finished, he said softly, "You're safe here." Tears filled her eyes, but they were not the same tears from the night by the creek. These were different. These were the kind that came when a broken heart starts to believe again. From that day forward, Emily began to change. She woke up earlier, helped more, and laughed sometimes, even if just a little. She found peace in small things, feeding animals, hanging laundry, watching sunsets. Daniel also changed in ways he didn't expect. For years he had lived alone, closing every door to keep the world out. But now the house felt less empty. Someone was humming softly in the kitchen in the morning. Someone was leaving a light on at night. Someone was making the silence feel warm instead of cold. As the months passed, Emily grew stronger. Her face looked brighter. Her steps became lighter. She learned to ride the horse gently with Daniel walking beside her. She smiled more often now. The woman who once whispered for her life to end was slowly learning to live again. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, Emily stood by the fence looking at the glowing sky. Daniel walked up beside her. She turned to him, her hair moving with the wind. "I'm leaving soon," she said softly. Daniel's heart tightened. He had known this day would come. She wasn't meant to stay forever. She had to build her life again, far beyond this quiet ranch. He nodded slowly. "Where will you go?" "There's a small town 2 hours from here," she said. "There's a shelter. They said they can help me find a place, a job, a fresh start." Daniel didn't try to stop her. He looked out at the horizon and said, "You'll be all right." She turned toward him, her eyes full of quiet strength. "I wouldn't have made it without you," she said. "You didn't have to help me, but you did, and you saved me." Daniel shook his head gently. "You saved yourself. I just gave you a place to breathe." Emily smiled. It was a full smile this time, not shy, not afraid. A smile of someone who had found herself again. The next morning, the old truck was waiting at the end of the dusty road. Her small bag was packed. She hugged Daniel tightly. Her hands no longer shook. "Thank you," she whispered. Daniel didn't say much. He wasn't a man of many words, but he placed his hand gently on her shoulder and said, "Go live." As she drove away, Daniel stood by the porch, watching the dust rise behind the truck. He felt the quiet settle around him again, but it wasn't the same as before. The silence didn't feel empty anymore. He walked back toward the fence line, the same place where he had heard that faint cry months ago. Life on the ranch continued as always. The horses needed feeding, the fences needed fixing. But something inside Daniel had changed forever. He had lowered his gun that night. He had chosen kindness instead of coldness. He hadn't asked for anything in return, but in saving someone else, he had saved a small part of himself too. Days turned into weeks, and sometimes, when the wind passed through the trees just right, he thought he could still hear her soft laughter on the porch. He smiled to himself and whispered into the quiet evening air, "You made it." The sun set behind the hills, painting the sky in gold and soft orange. Daniel stood there, hands in his pockets, the wind gently moving through the fields. He didn't need a grand ending or loud words. All he needed was this quiet knowing, because sometimes the greatest act of courage is not pulling the trigger but opening your heart.